So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new session of our IQS-Harvard talks. It's the third Harvard talk this year. And as you perhaps know, this series was created with a simple idea in mind, bringing inspiring voices like today from Harvard to our community, and trying to open conversations that connects society with technology, with science, and with management. And I think the good point, or the original point of this IQS Harvard talks, as like last year IQS Cambridge talks, is the enormous amount of work done for preparing these talks with our main interest, that is our students. So I think that this should be highlighted because you have worked a lot during this last month preparing this talk. And today it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Mina Cikara, yes, Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and Director of the Intergroup Neuroscience Lab at Harvard University. How can I describe this in a short manner? Because after me, Professor Comim just give more depth discussion on that. Dr. Cikara studies something that is both deeply human and highly relevant to the world we live today. How we understand, and I think it's very important, your comment, and sometimes fail to understand people who belong to different groups that our own. As a managing director of IQS, I understand perfectly this point. Her work combines psychology and neuroscience to explore empathy, conflict, cooperation, and social decision making. At IQS, we often focus in innovation, and we fill our mouth with this word, innovation. But innovation ultimately depends on people, on how we collaborate, how we build trust, and how we navigate differences. In that sense, understanding the mechanism of intergroup relations is just as important as understanding, molecules or materials. Dr. Cikara's research helped us think about these questions with scientific rigor and intellectual curiosity. Mina, let me call you Mina. Thank you very much for being with us today at IQS, and please, Professor Coming, just introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Now, before we start, I want to mention three things. The first thing is just to thank you all for being here today. Thank all faculty also for preparing the students for that. Thanks for so many colleagues from Pompeu, UAB, the General Director of ESADE as well, Daniel Trasser here. So it's a joy to see how we can collaborate between our different institutions of our university. And I also want to say that thanks to my dear wife who is here, what was a 10-minute introduction was reduced to a 1 page. So hopefully 3-minute presentation. And I want to say just to start acknowledging, it's a privilege to have Professor Cikara here with us. She's the Frederick Wertham Professor of Law and Psychiatry in Society at the Department of Psychology, as Professor Boros mentioned. She received her PhD in Psychology and Social Policy from Princeton, and then she went to complete a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT. And then before arriving at Harvard, she served as an assistant professor of social and Decision Sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. Now, one might think that because Professor Cikara is at the Department of Psychology, that her work might be of interest only to psychologists, but nothing further from the truth. It's really remarkable how her work spans an exceptionally broad range of academic disciplines, and I'm just going to mention just a few. Social psychology, cognitive neuroscience, intergroup relations, sociology, political science, political psychology, affective science, experimental and cognitive psychology, moral and social decision-making research, organizational studies, and behavioral economics. Now, in a single expression, her work is quintessentially interdisciplinary, and hers is not simply a story of academic excellency. It is the story of someone who has helped redefine what we know about key issues of our time, such as hate, discrimination, intergroup conflict, in-group bias, political sectarianism, and failures of empathy, including prejudice, stereotypes, and processes of dehumanizing others. Professor Cikara is one of the world's leading researchers in bringing together behavioral science, computational approaches, and neuroscience methods to understand how our minds and behavior change when we move from the me versus you to us versus them, and how that shift shapes our social categorization, moral judgment, and action where context always matters. Now, her publications have appeared in some of the most prestigious academic journals, including Science and Nature Human Behavior, often influencing conversations far beyond academia. Let me emphasize this last point, namely that her work does not stop at diagnosing problems. It identifies levers of change. For example, her work on the social neuroscience, I'm almost finishing, of prejudice, invites us to consider how to detect our biases, how to inhibit them, and implement egalitarian responses. This combination of diagnosis and possibilities makes Professor Cikara a bridge builder between science and society. Now, in today's world of polarization, fake news, misinformation, and intensifying intergroup tensions, her work offers a much-needed breath of fresh air in the search for ethical citizenship in plural societies. Her research agenda is a source of inspiration for all of us for being analytically rigorous, courageous, and a powerful evidence-based argument for rescuing our humanity. Now, Professor Cikara, we are honored to have you here with us today, and we are grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mina Cikara.
My goodness, however will I live up to this introduction? I want to start by thanking Dean Comim and all of you here so much for the pleasure and the privilege that it is to be with you today. Thank you all so much for making time to come to the talk today. I want to thank the incredible staff at IQS who has made this visit just seamless and such a joy. Barcelona is one of my favorite cities in the world, and I will jump at any excuse to be here. So it's really, really the pleasure and the privilege is all mine. And with that introduction, you know much more about me than you ever wanted to know. So I won't give you any further background about my work. I'm just going to jump into the content of the talk. I would love it if you would interrupt me with questions. I always prefer for there to be a conversation more than to have just a lecture at you. So as questions come up, please don't be shy. I'd love to talk to you about these things deeply. We have quite a bit of time, and I didn't prepare slides for the entire duration of that time. So by all means, do interrupt, and I'm very thrilled to interact. And I guess we have, I don't know how this will work logistically, but we have microphones, apparently, in order to facilitate this process. Okay, so I think hopefully my slides will show up before too long. I'm not sure if I'm meant to do something about that. I guess I could just mime the contents of the talk. Let's see, what happens if I do this?
No, let's hope we have the PowerPoint. So whoever is there.
There's no one there. Ha ha! You're all free to go. And that was the talk. This has all been a social experiment.
And the presentation is here.
Yeah, okay. We said something would happen. We said that we've been rehearsing since yesterday to just pull the curtain back a little bit here. I don't see anyone up there. No. This is awesome. This is a great icebreaker.
Yeah, and I have no comments here.
Yeah.
That's precisely what they do there.
Okay.
No, we relax.
Yeah, we relax.
Probably a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Of course, the first thing I have to say is based on a visual illusion that you can't see right now. Anyone have a good joke? I'm fresh out. Oh no, I've got one that my kid taught me. Okay, ready?
I can see someone moving.
Ah,
there.
someone's moving.
Oh, Victor.
Hey, it's Victor.
Yeah, we're so glad to
Hooray,
see you.
Victor's here.
Excellent.
Oh, hooray, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll save my joke till the end. Thank you, Victor. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'd like to kick us off with this visual illusion with which I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar. Sometimes it's referred to as the Ebbinghaus illusion. And in this illusion, when you look at it, you can't help but see the dot, the orange dot on the right, as larger than the orange dot on the left. However, when I remove the blue dots or the context around them, you see readily that they're the same size. Now, this is a bit of a hacky analogy, but it illustrates a fundamental tenet of our psychology, which is that context matters. And it matters for judgments of all kinds, ranging from psychophysics to social cognition. So what does this sort of a reference dependence mean in a time of great demographic change the globe over? And what can we exploit about what we know, given the quirks of human cognition and the mind, to build a more generalized model of how alliances will shift, invariant to the time, place, and groups in question? So if there's only one thing that you remember from this talk today, what I hope that it is that the way that you think about or see any one thing, including groups of people, will always depend on what else is around. That's the fundamental lesson from today. So I'd like to kick us off by making what I think is a fairly uncontroversial claim, which is that social groups are woven deeply into the fabric of our lives. They shape how we perceive, who we punish, who we learn from, what decisions we make, what we think is moral. The challenge for me is that I think that the social sciences have got a dominant model of studying and seeking to understand intergroup dynamics that actually has things flipped exactly the wrong way around. So what do I mean by this? What I would argue is that there is a sort of, and I would say driven in part by the prominence of this idea of social identity theory, which I think some of you, maybe many of you, are familiar with, and this demonstration of the minimal groups paradigm. Please raise your hand if you've heard of the minimal groups paradigm. Okay, only a couple. So this is this demonstration where experimentally you can randomly assign people to teams, and almost immediately they start to show in-group preferences. That is, they want to allocate resources more to their own group relative to the other group, despite the fact that these groups are created de novo, and they only just very immediately, very recently were created. And so the idea is that this demonstration really forefronted the role of category membership as the main driver of intergroup attitudes and behavior. The challenge for me is that I think that there are a lot of challenges with this approach. I would argue that it's limited because categories are not fixed, homogeneous entities. For one, the association with specific categories will change over time. And one of my favorite historical examples to think about is, for example, how it is that Irish and Italian immigrants became racialized as white in the earliest 20th century in America, despite being seen as ethnic others when they first arrived. So that change means that the meaning of the category changes. The category is not a static entity. Moreover, we would say that allegiances between categories obviously evolve over time, and that will then affect the nature of the interactions between them. So you can think about, for example, Americans' relationships with Germans now versus, say, 80, 90 years ago. Obviously, that's going to then engender incredibly different relational expectations and behaviors, despite the categories remaining the same. And the last thing I'll say is that, of course, it's not the case that all categories carry with them the sort of psychological potency of purposive groups. So, to the best of my knowledge, we've never been concerned about, say, an uprising of brunettes, despite that being a visually identifiable category to which some people belong and others do not. The next thing I'm going to argue is that studies that are based on category membership make it really difficult to infer from them anything about generalized group processes. So specific categories will have with them associated specific prejudices or stereotypes. People's perceptions or familiarity with the groups in question will differ across different contexts. And of course, it's also the case that not all conflicts are two-party conflicts. So this dominant model of one in-group and one out-group is really rather impoverished when we think about the way that group dynamics play out in the real world, where we have much more flexible and dynamic types of situations, often with multi-party conflict. So in short, I don't know what aspects of, say, an interracial interaction will port over into an interpartisan interaction. And even if I did, I don't know for certain that those would necessarily generalize across time, across people, and across countries. The last thing I'll say about this is that the categories approach is really context insensitive. It breaks down as agents' priorities change or as their other intersecting identities become salient in a given context. So in the US, we have this adage, not all skin folk is kinfolk, right? So just because you share a category membership marked by melanin doesn't necessarily mean you have the same interests or political priorities. And it also is related to this notion of how it is that so many Americans were confused by the number of Hispanic voters, for example, who voted for Trump in the 2020 election. And so I'd like to argue that any research that treats demographic categories as though they're purposive group is going to continue to run into these explanatory limitations and may ironically end up reinforcing the stereotype that these groups represent social monoliths. And that then actually undermines the very thing many of us say we seek to mitigate, is this notion of categorization and essentialism and misunderstandings of other people on the basis of their category membership. So I would argue that studying only explicit categories is not likely to get us very far in an understanding of generalized intergroup processes. So the puzzle that has seized me is then, what are these alternative cues to social group understanding that are less hampered by these limitations? What else could we be studying instead of categories? And moreover, what are some of the predicted consequences of coalitions that organize and reorganize as a function of changing circumstances? And that is what I would argue is reference dependence. Okay, so my big picture goal for today is to get all of us, and again, I'm so grateful to you all for the incredible preparation you've done. I understand that many of you gone through many of my papers. I'm sorry. I hope you got something out of them. But my goal for you all, but also really my field in particular, is to get people to think not only in terms of categories, but also more in terms of a generalizable coalitional psychology. And I'd like to emphasize now, and I will continue to emphasize this is not an either-or argument. I'm not saying that people don't care about categories or that categories don't influence our social processes. Demonstrably, they do. They shape who we perceive, how we mark others as with us or against us. That's absolutely true. What I want to do is be more precise about when it is that these categories are no longer helpful units of explanation for the very phenomena that we seek to understand. And so to that end, my plan for today is to move through 3 parts. The first part is going to ask, how is it that people infer coalition in the absence of category labels? That is, what is one possible model of how it is that people do this in their heads? And I should say that this is going to be a pretty high-level talk. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details. All of this work is published or is posted as a preprint, so if you are curious about those things are publicly available and I can direct you to them. The second part is going to ask, do we see predicted effects of coalitional psychology on intergroup violence and attitudes? And here what I'm trying to do is it's going to provide a couple of brief findings to bolster this idea that reference dependence can scale up not only from how we think about individuals, but to coalitions over sets of groups. And the third is the most recent work. It's not published yet, so not even hot off the presses. It's not out there, though it is available in a preprint. It's going to extend this analysis to partisanship and parties in a US context, but my hope for this is that we could start to look at this in a cross-comparative context in different countries. And if any of you are interested in that, please do let me know at the end of the talk. I'm always looking for collaborators. Okay, so let's start. What do we do when there are no category labels or cues? Now, one dominant model of how people think we make sense of other people and figure out who is with me, who is against me, is that we try to assess via interaction how aligned we are with any one agent in a room. So let's say you walk in and you meet A, B, and C. And here the weight of the lines is your estimate of how aligned you are maybe in your interests or in what you prioritize and for welfare of other people, or even just what movies you like. And so here you say, how similar am I to A, how similar am I to B, how similar am I to C? And from there, you start to draw estimates of how likely am I to align with this person on any interaction or coordination going forward. And so we would say that in this case, people are relying on dyadic similarity with each person in their environment to figure out who goes with whom. But it's possible that people are doing something slightly more complicated than this. It's possible that they're not only paying attention to how aligned they are with each person, but how aligned each person is with everybody else in the room. And this is an interesting feature because it's definitely the case we know since Hyder, right? Since the 1940s, people do pay attention to the relationships amongst other agents in their environments to try to figure out who they're most likely to get along with. And so you might find that even though you're equally aligned with A and with B here, what happens is C is very, very tight with B. And by virtue of C also being very, very tight with you, that may bring B closer to you. And it may lead you to infer a grouping that includes U, B, and C, despite the fact that A and B are roughly equivalent in how similar they are to you. Okay, so let's make this a little bit more concrete about how it is we would study such a notion. Here we have a toy example, and let's say that you are part of a film club, and you, Alice, and Bob here are tasked with selecting a film each week to fit that week's theme. And imagine in the very first week, you have Disney is your theme. And here you have to choose between Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. It turns out that you and Bob have similar preferences here. And so you might say, okay, my estimate right now is that Bob is more aligned with me. And in weeks going forward, Bob is going to be a good ally for the movie selection task. But then the next week comes up and it's a monster theme, and this time allegiances has shifted. You and Alice have closer preferences than you and Bob. So at a dyadic similarity account, you should be indifferent in your estimates of how likely Alice and Bob are to align with you in the following week, week 3 of the club. All right, but it's possible that you're doing something a little bit more complicated than that. So under a dyadic similarity, under a social structure learning account, people use statistical learning algorithms to try to figure out and sort individuals into these latent groupings on the basis of observing their behavior and their preferences. So these group representations are updated as we accumulate more evidence. This makes them incredibly flexible. So week to week, as you get more data, you can start to change your posterior over which groupings you think are the most likely. So let's make this a little bit more concrete. In the absence of any data, you should think that it's equally likely that you, Alice, and Bob belong to 3 separate groups, as indicated by 3 separate colors. That's equally likely as you, Bob, and Alice going together, as you and Bob going together, as you and Alice going together, or all 3 of you belonging to the same group. This is the uniform distribution. When you don't have any evidence, you should think all of these possibilities are equally likely. But then you get a little bit of evidence, and you apply Bayes' rule to them, and that should then update your posterior over groupings. After this first instance, that grouping that includes you and Bob, that posterior has increased, right? Your belief that that's the most likely grouping is now the best one. Then you get a little bit more evidence and you update your posterior again over groupings and so on. So in other words, it's a very simple principle. The idea is that we observe people's behavior. We also observe how they align with one another in order to update our posterior over all possible groupings. Okay. Now, how might we adjudicate between the predictions that are made by a dyadic similarity model versus a latent structure learning account? Well, let's draw out the hypothesis space here in this tiny diagram to make things a little bit more concrete. And so in a dyadic similarity perspective, here we say that distance in this space is a proxy for alignment. And in a dyadic similarity account, two predictions fall out. The first is that you should be indifferent between A and B because they're equally distant from you. The second prediction that falls out of a dyadic similarity account is that the presence of a third agent should not affect your preferences. Does that make sense? So if all you care about is how aligned or similar you are with A and how aligned you are with similar with B, let's say C comes in, C shouldn't make any difference in how you feel about A versus B. Under a structured learning account, however, you might find that C comes in and C is very, very, very well aligned with you and more aligned with B than with A. And that might lead you to believe is that a grouping that includes you, B, and C is the most likely grouping in this particular social ecology. And that may bring B closer to you and make you feel like you are more aligned with B, even though mathematically B and A are equivalent. And so we're going to call this a high C agreement case. Now, of course, C could come in and do something very, very different. C could come in and disagree with you and everything you stand for, but still be closer to B than with A. And that may lead you to infer a grouping that includes B and C together, but not you. And in this case, that may repel you from B and push you a little closer to liking A now. Okay, so the prediction then falling out of this, the thing I should say is how do we begin to index preference in this kind of a design? Well, one way to measure this is we can just force people to tell us between A and B, who would you prefer to act as your proxy? Let's say there's a time that you can't make it to the meeting. Who would you cast your vote with? Who do you trust to represent your interests? And you just choose between A and B. Okay, so just to beat a dead horse, what we would say under a latent structure learning account is that following a high C agreement case where C brings B closer to you, you should show a preference for B over A relative to those cases where C pulls B away from you, in which case you should start to prefer A over B. Under a dyadic similarity account, however, you should be indifferent, right, between A and B because they're equally similar to you. Is the prediction sensible? It makes sense. Very good. Okay. So we actually set out to test these competing predictions using people's political issue positions, in part because political issue positions signal people's values and goals for others' welfare in incredibly social consequential contexts. Yes?
Microphone before, otherwise people don't see the translation in case they leave. Oh, but Mina is coming here. Thank you, Mina. He's coming here with the microphone.
No, again, I confess I had no idea how this would work logistically. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ima. This is very attractive model to me, but my question is whether a Bayesian model does actually reflects, I mean, it seems that it reflects a very rational person and we're not so rational,
yeah,
maybe?
No,
Okay.
Great. So this is at best some vague approximation of what we think people are actually doing. And it's interesting because later on I'll tell you a little bit of anecdotal evidence to indicate that I don't think people are counting up the number of times that people are agreeing and disagreeing with them, but there is a sort of almost affective element. The representation gets built of almost like I can't put my finger on why, but I just feel like this person is closer to me. And so there's something keeping track. And we have later on, we have fMRI data where we use exactly the task I'm about to show you. And what we find is that this representation of structural alignment from the estimates that are given by the Bayesian model, as opposed to just the dyadic similarity, are encoded in anterior insula, which is often associated with affective processes, both positive and negative. And so that was a really, really interesting finding because it does have a set, it's almost like people are operating on vibes, if you will. But the Bayesian model gives us some way to model it explicitly, and so that we can build a model and formalize the process by which we think something like this might be happening, though I don't think people are actually doing, the applying Bayes' rule in their heads. Yeah. Very good. Okay. So the issues here are around political issues, in part because we think that these are consequential things. Like here, for example, we have equal pay. And we chose these sorts of stimuli because people coordinate their behavior in socially consequential coalitions over political issues like this, right? In fact, I've seen the banners all over town where we're talking about dismantling gender-based stereotypes. I was walking down the street yesterday and I know that there was a big protest by all the teachers. So, these are the types of issues over which people are coordinating day in, day out. Okay, so to give you a sense of what this experiment looked like, what we had people do was enter this environment. This is a snapshot of the screen. And the first thing they would do is tell us how they felt. So should employees be required, should employers be required to pay men and women the same salary for the same job? First, you tell us how you feel. I would say yes, obviously. And then my answer would be registered over here on this matrix. But I'm not alone in this room, right? There are 3 other agents in the room. And so the next person for whom I'm making a guess is Annie. I have to guess now how Annie feels about this. If you look really closely, that first row of X's and check marks is one issue back in time that you haven't seen. And the last time we had to look at a political issue, Annie and I disagreed. And so I might say, okay, I don't think Annie actually supports equal pay. And I say no, and I would receive feedback that I'm correct. Annie does not support equal pay. And so on and so forth. And we go through, we learn about all of these agents across 8 different issues. And then we finally arrive to something called the mystery choice trial. And here, what we're doing is we're asking, there is a mystery issue that's at stake here. You don't know what the issue is, and you have to pick between Annie and Betsy, say, to represent your vote, despite not knowing what the issue is. With whom would you cast your vote, or who would you trust to vote in your interest? Okay, critically, this is not something that participants saw, but I'm going to show it to you because it's important for the design of the experiment. The experiment was programmed to create a high C or a low C agreement case in every block. And so here, if I change agreement to 1 and disagreement to 0, again, this is not something participants saw. This is just for your benefit. If you add up across the different issues, you see critically, you and Annie and Betsy agreed an equal number of times. That is, you agreed with Annie 4 times, you agreed with Betsy 4 times. Or I should say they agreed with you, because the experiment was designed specifically to make the agents agree with you this number of times. However, Carol comes in and she agrees with you 7 out of 8 times. Carol is your best friend. You and Carol are really well aligned. Critically, Carol is better aligned with Betsy than with Annie. And so that's what creates a sort of high C agreement case here. But of course, I could invert Carol's answers, and what you find here now is Carol only agrees with you 1 time on 1 out of 8 issues, but she still agrees more with Betsy than Annie. So this is going to be what we call the low C agreement case. The question, of course, is, does this affect people's preferences when they have to do the mystery choice trial? And so what we found here is, again, the prediction from a dyadic similarity account is that these bars are exactly the same height and they're both at 50%. But that's not what we see. Yes? Mike's coming.
Yes, hello, thank you. I have a question for the previous, when you were explaining the rounds, that we're assuming that every round of prediction has the same importance to us,
Yes.
no? But I guess this is a bit different from reality because, for
Yes.
example, something can have lexicographic priority to me, and some things also cannot be compared.
Yes.
They're incommensurable. So.
Gorgeous. Perfect question. Absolutely. So what I would say is this is the dumbest version of this experiment because it doesn't weight the issues by importance to respondents. It isn't accounting for the fact that if on one trial there's one issue that is like you're a single issue voter, it happens to go against what our manipulation is, it should wipe out the effect. So what you're observing here, and this is a perfect segue to what I'm about to show you, which is a pretty, it's exactly what we predicted to find, but it's a small effect. And so I think the reason it's a small effect is because there's quite a bit of noise in the data for exactly the thing you put your finger on. And so, if we were to make a more sophisticated version where the agents not only agree or disagree with you 447 or 441, and we integrated the weights on the issues, we would get a much better distinction between these two conditions. It's an excellent question. It's exactly the right question. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that if I drew a line at 50% across the screen here, what you would see is that there's a greater disadvantage to the low C condition as opposed to advantage bumping you up over the high C condition. And the reason I think that's the case, it's not a symmetric effect. The reason I think that's the case is because someone in your social ecology disagreeing with you on 7 out of 8 issues is an incredibly salient agent. And so the potency of that agent to pull B from you could potentially be stronger, a la the negativity bias, by comparison to those cases where everybody in the room agrees with you at least half the time, which is a much more congenial room, you might imagine. And yet still we see that there's a bump up above 50% in that case where it's a high C agreement. Okay, very good. So it does look like people are doing something more sophisticated than just dyadic similarity. Of course they're doing dyadic similarity because you couldn't do structural learning in the absence of that. It's a foundational block to build towards the latent structural learning model. That said, they're not stopping there. And moreover, you may be wondering, well, is it just about these little boxes and people making these arbitrary choices, or are there actually social consequences to some of these judgments? We find that following a high C agreement case, people not only cast their vote with B more than A, they also think B is more moral, competent, and likable. So it does seem to affect downstream attributions that people make to the agents in the game. We also find that even when you give people easier cues, like team color to pay attention to, they still integrate the latent structure information in order to guide their judgments. So they're able to do exactly what a Bayesian model would predict, which is they take in categories as priors, but those categories are flexible in the sense that they are not determinative of how people align themselves. You can start to populate that latent profile or that distribution of the posterior distribution of the latent groupings by virtue of updating in light of the evidence you receive inside of the experiment. So color doesn't stop being a useful indicator of who goes with me versus not, but it gets integrated with the information we give them in the course of the experiment. Okay, so what do I think the implications for group psych are here? Well, I'd argue that thinking in terms of latent group structure enriches existing theory because it moves us away from dyadic similarity or mere shared category membership as the sole inputs to group representation and inference. Again, I also think that the category-based approach is limited because it's context insensitive. But by contrast to the category approach, this latent structure learning approach is very flexible and it prioritizes alignment in the here and now. So as new agents and environments pop up, new inferences can be created. Nothing binds you to whatever your previous instances or T-1 inference was. You're just constantly integrating new information. And if, say, you move into a room and the task switches, maybe you're in a study group for history and you have this one person who you think is particularly good for that and you're aligned with them, but then suddenly you're studying for a math exam and it's this other person, you can update very quickly over who you want your partner to be, right? And so that's exactly this notion, is how, and it includes this flexibility in it. The other thing that I really love about it is that it's context sensitive in the sense that it can also accommodate more than two groups. There's nothing about this model that requires there to be only one latent structure. You can infer 2, 3, 4 groups in the environment. It is biased to find a smaller number of groups in order to sort of maintain what we think humans are doing, right? Which tends to be more simplifying the social environment than making it more complex. That said, it's perfectly possible that with more agents, you could infer many more clusters than just 2. And then finally, I would say, I like that it can integrate priors over groupings. So again, like in that last experiment I told you where we had just team colors as the prior, that could guide your decisions early on in the absence of any contravening evidence. But as you accumulate more evidence, it's possible for you to integrate it over those priors. So let's say we want to use political party or we want to use race and ethnicity as our priors. Sure, I think that's what people are doing day in, day out. But it's not determinative of their attitudes and behaviors. There are other issues and high stakes preferences and values over which people can align and realign themselves in light of what's happening day to day in their lives. So what I want you to take away from this part of the talk is this simple sort of shared category account is incomplete. It's not that it's wrong, but it's incomplete. Rather, by understanding how we infer latent group structures, we can start to build a more complete and complex understanding of how coalitional boundaries are inferred and updated. Okay, so before I move on to the next one, any questions on that first part? Yes, please.
Wait, please.
Just a quick clarification because the question came up and so you were explaining that picture where you had that final answer and I didn't get the entire experiment. So when you go to the 447, then what is the question that you ask on that last particular question?
Yes, so it's just with whom would you cast your vote, A or B?
It's just, okay,
yeah.
Got it, thanks.
But thank you for asking the clarification. That's very important. And it is a forced choice, yes, yeah. Okay, so now what I want to do is take this notion of social group inference and scale it up to coalitions, that is over sets of people, because you have A, B, and C, these are just 3 individuals in the room, but what if we're talking instead of individuals about groups? Can we make predictions about how coalitions will form and reform facing differential social ecological pressures and mobilization and demographic change and so on and so forth? And so here I'm going to introduce the group reference dependence hypothesis, which is just that group members' reactions to any one other group will depend on what other groups are around. And so again, this is pushing us past this notion of just one in-group and just one out-group to try to understand how it is that the beliefs or preferences of brown groups is shaped by the distribution of groups in your ecology. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, let's give this example. Let's say you have this majority group that's lived in a region for many, many decades. And they've coexisted with this other smaller minoritized group in their region. They don't necessarily like each other and they don't get along very well, but they've tolerated one another now for years, and this is how they've lived. Then comes mass migration from another region and a new group shows up. One of the first questions social psychologists typically want to ask is how does the majority group feel about this new group? They're bigger, they're coming in much faster than this old minority group that we've dealt with for many decades and that we've lived side by side and tolerated one another. So this is a sort of first order question, what's our response to this newcomer? But my interest is in, it doesn't stop there. There's another question you can ask, which is what does the presence of this new group do in terms of my relationship with my old outgroup, the outgroup that's been here for a long time? And so the idea here is that it might be, as indicated by these three negative lines, we maintain staunchly negative attitudes towards everybody. I didn't like you before, I still don't like you, I also don't like these new people, and that's where I stand. But an alternative possibility is that we start to pull our old minoritized group a little bit closer to build a coalition against this new potential threat. We don't know these people, I at least know you, and so on. And then by building this coalition, it could potentially neutralize attitudes towards this other minoritized group with which we've coexisted for a long time, or even potentially make them positive. Okay, so this is the basic idea here with the group reference dependence hypothesis. So in this paper, what we sought to do was test a specific corollary of this group reference dependence hypothesis. So here what we said was, we use group size as a generalized cue to group threat. However, we argue that it's more complicated than just size. So here what we said was, rather than being sensitive only to the absolute size of any one minoritized group, communities will be sensitive to their relative rank in size. Now you may be wondering to yourself, why you care about rank? All you need to know is how big the other group is in order to figure out how threatening they are, right? There are a couple of reasons. And again, this comes back to some of the funny quirks of human cognition. So I'm not sure if any of you have ever studied sort of numeric psychology, but humans are pretty bad estimators. That is to say, if you ask people to guess the size of a group, say the proportion of a population that a small group is, they tend to give you wildly inflated estimates. So if you ask about like a particular immigrant population, or if you ask about the number of people within a society that are LGBTQ, they give you these huge numbers, 3 times, 4 times what the actual demographic size is. It turns out this is true across all domains. It's not specific to demographics. It's just a quirk of how we represent proportional distributions. So people have in their heads something like a log odds distortion. And the consequence of that is that when you have organized from smallest to largest groups, people tend to overestimate the size of the small groups, but simultaneously underestimate the size of the larger groups. Now, this distortion means people are really bad at answering the question, what percentage of the population is this group? But this distortion leaves most of the ordinal judgments intact. So people can say, okay, I don't actually know what proportion those people are of our society, but I can tell you that they're bigger or they're smaller than these other people. That is actually very well preserved despite these proportions. The other feature of rank that's incredibly important is that it has built into it this reference dependence. When one group goes up, by definition, another one must go down. And so in it, it has this relational dependence built in as a variable. And that is why I think that people do actually pay very close attention to rank, and to the extent that that's true, then it can act as an input to their social behavior and their attitudes. Okay, so given humans' general accuracy with rank estimates and the representation of relative group positions, we predicted that people would discriminate most against whichever minoritized group would represent the largest minority group in their environment, followed by the second largest, followed by the third, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, this also predicts that as groups change rank, people's behavior towards them should change accordingly. So this has a generalized prediction that falls out of this generalized threat queue based on the group size. It's group size that we use to compute rank. So how did we operationalize this? Well, in this one paper with my colleagues Vicky Fuca and Marco Tabolini, this is my crash course in econometrics, our independent variable here is the size and rank of minoritized group at the county level. So here what we did was we tested the group reference dependence hypothesis in the US context, and we focused on majority group, that is white people here, their treatment of 4 minoritized racial and ethnic groups within the US context. This is Black, Asian, Hispanic, and Arab. And Arab had to be constructed because it turns out Middle East and North Africa is a category only in the most recent census. Okay, and we use the data from the US Census of the population between 1990 and 2010. So we have 3 waves, 90, 2000, 2010. And then from that data, we can construct for each decade in each county the size of these 4 groups and their relative rank with respect to one another. So that's our independent variable. Critically, we are always controlling for the fixed effects of county, of decade, of which group it is, and always controlling for group size. So any effect that we observe of rank is above and beyond the base rates of, say, running into that group. Because of course larger groups are gonna run into them more often, so base rates would just say, of course they're gonna be victimized more often. That variance is already soaked up by the group size for which we are controlling. The critical first dependent variable is going to be the hate crimes perpetrated by white offenders against each of these minoritized groups per 100,000 inhabitants. So how likely is a group to be victimized when it's in first place versus second place versus third place and so on? And the prediction is higher rank means more victimization. We then also looked at whether or not these effects would replicate when we look at a different indicator of hate, and in this case it's prejudice. So these are explicit thermometer ratings of warmth against these 4 groups, both in the US and the UK context. Now, I could give a whole talk on just this paper, so what I will give you is the top line summary and then show you just one data point that I think is pretty important for making my reference dependent story. In short, we find support for the group reference dependence hypothesis. When a group is higher in rank, they're more likely to be victimized with hate crimes, irrespective of which group we're talking about, Black, Hispanic, Asian, because of course these groups are not equally distributed across the geography. Some places have much larger Asian populations, like in the Bay Area in California. Other places in the American South have much larger Black populations. And so the rank ordering of these groups can change, or it changes over regions, but it can also change across time. Similarly, we find that these effects are obtained when we look at the explicit thermometer rating, so it's not restricted only to these very extreme forms of discrimination and prejudice like hate crimes. It does manifest also in these softer forms like feeling thermometer ratings, and it replicates also in the UK. Now, the data point to which I want to draw your attention is this figure here. So here what I'm showing you is just the marginal effects of rank switches. Sorry, there are questions. Yeah, please.
It's just a clarification, please. On the victimization,
yes.
The variables you're mentioning, are them supposed to be perception or actual victimization?
Yes, great question. So this is FBI uniform crime reporting data that logs the incidence of hate crimes across the US across these 3 decades. So it's actual perpetration of hate crimes. Interestingly, it includes both violent and nonviolent forms. So you could imagine things like property destruction and graffiti that's full of hateful speech. That's also included in the data set. When we restrict only to violent crime, we still obtain our effects. Yeah, but that's a great question. Thank you for asking me to clarify. Yes. Oh, sorry, Mike.
It's really you're going to say that's not. Can you go back to your variable definition?
Yeah. Nope.
Your 100K in the denominator?
100, yeah, per 100,000 inhabitants, yeah.
Because the problem is that if you have a larger group in that society,
yeah.
I mean the numerator will rise, but
yeah.
the denominator will not change. So let's say because you're dividing by the size of the county.
Yeah.
Right? But
well, we're always dividing by 100,000 inhabitants. Yeah, it's just to reduce the number. It's just to shrink it to the fraction. Yeah.
I understand because
yeah.
the problem is so let's say you have a county and that county has more. Let's use Arabs
yeah.
as an example, right?
Yeah.
So even if it's random, you're gonna if it's a larger proportion of Arabs, you're gonna target Arabs more likely.
Perfect.
So
yes, which is why we have to control for group size. So in the regression, you are already controlling for the size, and we're looking whether rank has an effect above and beyond that. But this is incredibly important, and I'm glad you asked again, because this is what controls for the base rates of just running into the most populous group. Yes, 100%.
Got it.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, my question is more on intersectionality. Because, for example, we assume homogeneity within its group, which is racial.
Yeah.
But of course, we have more specific groups within
Absolutely.
the groups that are also informed by historical and political contextual factors.
100%.
So I have read the paper, so
Yeah.
I know that you're mentioning it, but I would like also to see how you can integrate it in such
Account for
areas.
this.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. A couple of things to note here. The first thing is that men are much more likely to be targeted with hate crime than women in these minoritized communities, in part because of how hate crimes are defined. So there's also a definitional question here, which is why it was all the more important that we had multiple outcome variables where we could test this hypothesis. The other thing is that for anyone who knows any of this data, it's actually slightly problematic in the sense that there's quite a bit of missingness in it, and missingness may not be random. However, we have a bunch of robustness checks that we look to see whether or not the effect is conditional on including more or less sort of low or high quality data. And it's a story that seems much more consistent with noise than any of the missingness being able to explain our effect. In terms of intersectionality, I mean, I think technically we could probably go back and look into it. There's all this other theorizing in social psychology that says that minoritized targets, that men tend to be more recipients of discrimination, particularly violent forms of discrimination relative to women. But this is a bit of a longer conversation, I think, to not take us off track. And then your second question was, now I'm forgetting.
For example, intersectionality.
Yeah.
It's also based on political and
yes,
historical and
perfect.
factual.
Yes, thank you. I would never want to argue that group size based rank is the sole input to which groups get targeted. Of course, there are political and religious elites that draw our attention to target much, much smaller groups. And so this is hardly the only indicator that's going to tell us who's at risk of being targeted with hate crimes. I think what we sought to understand was we already knew that rhetoric and attentional bias towards particular groups and scapegoating-like processes could have this effect. The question was whether from a bottom-up kind of observation of our social ecologies, is there still room for this to have an effect? And it looks like despite the influence of these top-down inputs, that there is still a chance for there to be some sort of demographic input that people take into account. The other finding I love is that in the UK, the data are really, really incredible because you can get multiple regional sizes of analysis. And so in the UK, we can get to something as small as, it's called a lower level super output area, and the median size of it is 1,500 people. If you look at regional variation in the census data, counties are already like on average 1 million people, and that's a lot of averaging over. When you get down to 1,500 people, that gives you incredibly really fine-grained access to the geographical distribution of how it is that people are distributed throughout the UK. Our effects get stronger and more precise at these smaller units of analysis, which strongly suggests to us that some of the way that these representations are built, though I don't have a mechanism, are through day in, day out experience. It's who you see in the supermarket, who you run into at the post office. It's not about like having some top-down information from the local newspaper that says, we just released our census, and this is the breakdown of people in this community. The other reason that we think direct perceptual access and experience with these groups is what's actually acting as the input to people's prejudices here, is because when you look at the diversity of the community does not change our effects. In fact, our effects get stronger the more diverse the community is because those third and fourth ranked groups are large enough to detect. The thing that matters for our effect most is how people are distributed. That is, do they live interdigitated with one another, or do they live in segregated societies, segregated communities or counties in the US data? Those places where people live in enclaves, more diversity means better prediction of rank for hate crimes. When people live interdigitated with one another, rank no longer has an effect. It's the one thing that breaks our effect, is how people are distributed spatially in their geography, not how many of them there are. Does that make sense? Okay. So diversity it's not just as simple as, what is the census and what is the distribution of all these different groups? It's also how they're spatially distributed that matters quite a lot for who you run into, and how sort of casual contact could potentially eat away at some of the inputs that then yield to things like prejudice and hate crimes. Okay. So yes,
Sorry,
yes,
I have
please.
maybe one last question.
Yes.
Because we're talking about, again, when talking about the rankings, I would guess is the ranking within the county and how people are distributed within the county, but maybe the perception. Did you account for perception in any way? Because maybe the media outlets or whatever you're getting your information is talking about an input of immigrants that maybe is not the reality in your county, but that's shifting your perception of threat, and therefore is that accounted in any way?
Yeah, we don't. We don't have any measure of direct perception where we've asked people, what is your estimate, for example, of these things, because it's historical data. That said, we have those two indirect indicators, like lower level super output, stronger and less noisy effects. And the other thing is the segregation versus integration. Clearly, there's something perceptual going on in the sense that you would imagine in a segregated society, the base rates of running into that person are much lower than if you live next door to them in a much more integrated, sort of spatially integrated society. The other thing is that again, I do think that there's always running in the background these top-down influences, whether it's media reporting on things, whether it's your religious leaders, your political leaders. And again, the question was just, of course, we know that those exist in the environment. Can we potentially observe this effect despite that? And it turns out, yes. There's an interesting possibility, though, where political leaders and maybe religious leaders, if they seek to foment division, seize on the fact that this group of people, it seems like they're starting to grow. And that's enough. It's used as an instrument rather than as like the first thing. Anyway, but yeah, I'd love to discuss that more. I think it's a really important question. What is the channel by which people are building these representations? We have a project now that I'm very excited about, but it's so early. I can't say really anything definitively about it. But what we're trying to figure out is using historical Google Maps data, how it is that the presence of restaurants and language on signage is changing over time to indicate that there are people from other places with other languages, and whether that might be acting as a possible input to people's downstream attitudes and behavior. But yeah, I think it could be something like, oh my gosh, there's a Korean megachurch in my neighborhood all of a sudden. I didn't realize there were that many Korean people here. That needed their own church, a megachurch. So I think that there are these sorts of processes that potentially unfold at the meso level that cue people's attention, and then they start to encode that information more deeply. Yeah. Okay, great. So what is the data point to which I want to draw your attention here for the reference dependence story? This comes back to that toy example with the pink and the blue and the red bubble, right? So what we find here, what I have here is the marginal effect of rank switches on how these groups are treated. And critically, what you find is that the rank effects are roughly symmetric when you go up versus down a rank. What does that mean? This means that the increase in victimization that a group experiences going from second to first is roughly equivalent to the decrease in hate crimes they receive when they slip from first to second. This strongly suggests that people have something like a perceived closed system of hatred. It didn't have to be this way, right? It could be that, okay, when you're in first, you're in deep shit no matter what happens with the other groups, right? You're going to get victimized, and it's going to stay that way even if another group eclipses you in terms of your rank. But that's not what happened. People pull closer the former first-ranked group. They become more tolerant of them the same time that they're becoming more hateful towards the new first-ranked group. And this is incredibly important because one strategy to deal with big demographic changes is to infer new groupings. Again, you could theoretically maintain the same level of hatred towards any newcomer as you did your former outgroup. That was your main priority for the decades to come. But this is strategically a terrible idea. You would be entirely surrounded by foes, right? So an alternative strategy then is to pull closer those people who you at least know a little better. So this has two effects. One, it focuses on your resources. It focuses your resources on whoever the primary threat is at that moment. But the other possibility is, and I don't have any evidence to speak to this, so it's purely speculative, but the other possibility is that it also forecloses on alliance building between minoritized groups. So if all of a sudden I'm more tolerant towards the old foe, I say to them something like, well, isn't it better with us here? Isn't it better the way we treat you now? Remember how it used to be? That was bad. This is much better. And certainly you wouldn't want to cast your lot with them. We both don't like them. So it actually forecloses on this alliance building that could be happening across the minoritized populations against the majority, which is also very, again, clever in terms of political strategy. Okay. So the take-home message, I think, here is the current findings at the group level dispel the notion that prejudice towards any one group is somehow derived from those categories' essentialized properties, right? That there's something inside those categories that elicits our behavior toward them. Rather, how far or close a group is to you depends in part on who else is around. So this is what I mean when I say it's sort of category invariant, right? It's not about what is in that, and of course stereotypes matter, but again, stereotypes are always shifting. And so how do we gain any traction? Maybe by using some of these more generalized cues. And then to tie these first two parts together, whether it's figuring out which agent we want to align or which group is a safer coalition partner, the bottom line is these evaluations are never made in a vacuum. Changing one node creates a ripple effect in the entire network in how close or far other groups are from us. And so keeping in mind this reference dependence and sensitivity to local conditions, I want to now turn to the newest part of the talk and last part of the talk, which is what does any of this have to do with partisanship? So I have this paper with my two brilliant colleagues, Joel Martinez and Neil Lewis, and we've made this plea to social psychologists to please stop using categories as the sole unit of explanation for all these phenomena that we care about in psychology, like inequality, prejudice, discrimination, variation in health outcomes, income inequality, and so on and so forth. But now I have my sights set on a slightly different audience, which is to try to convince the political psychologists that they should also not reify group parties as somehow being inherently monolithic. And so this is in response to what I take to be sort of the two dominant frameworks of partisanship in the last decade. One, which I would argue is the newer, is an identity-based framework, and it draws largely on social identity theory. And the way that this literature reads is, well, basically, political parties are like sports teams. You have one to which you are committed, and there's this sort of identity component. You feel like it's part of you, you are part of it, and you actually don't have any strong political issue preferences. You get those from the party. The party comes first, and then your preferences fall out of that. But much older and storied theory within political science says, no, the spatial voting models and every variant and downstream version thereof says, well, no, people actually do have pretty strong preferences on some political issues. Maybe they aren't deeply politically knowledgeable across the board, but they care about some things, and they select into parties on the basis of those interests, which party matches their platform preferences better. So what I've been mulling over for a few years is how incredibly difficult it is to try to parse the variance explained by these two features, because they're completely interdependent. If I give you category membership, if I give you party membership, I'm automatically cueing your associates on issues. If I give you issue position information, I'm automatically cueing what the party of that person is. So we have a really big problem here in terms of trying to quantify what is the variance explained by each of these things separately. And so I'm wondering whether or not this reference dependence that's built into this sort of coalitional thinking can help offer a unifying framework that integrates over both of these things and tries to make predictions about how it is that these parties could evolve going forward. Because who falls into which party changes over time. Which political issue stances each party adopts also changes over time. So can we possibly begin to predict how it is that these parties would evolve, both in terms of which issues they prioritize, as well as which groups are seen as stereotypically part of said party? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So who goes with whom? Polarization debates in the US in particular, this is like a huge industry, cottage industry now in the literature, in political psychology, political science, psychology, sociology. Everybody's talking about polarization, and specifically affective polarization, or what I call prejudice. I don't know why we needed a new word, but here we are. In American politics. And so the dominant model is that there are just these two sorted camps. Because we have a two-party system, people tend to assume that there's just two sets of people who align either more with Republicans or more with Democrats. But we actually don't, to my best understanding, have an empirical map of how people perceive these coalitions and whether or not there are indeed only two parties, or that is two camps to guide these two parties. And the reason that this perceptions matter is because they guide vote choice behavior, they guide perceptions of who could be viable coalitional partners, and they guide political influence, who you would listen to as an authority on what it is that you care about. So one possibility is that people really just have two camps inside their head, in which case you only need one dimension to separate them. And presumably that's the canonical left-right ideological dimension. But what if it's not just two clusters? What if people have a more complicated structure inside of their heads? We don't usually, we just assume that away. But what if you just interrogated it and discovered the structure inside people's heads using inductive methodology? And so if there's more than 2 clusters, this offers the possibility of a multidimensional space, which then means you could have different alternative strategies for alignment. It's not just moving left to right and closer or farther. You could have other dimensions along which you could be moving. And so the question that we seek to understand here is not just how many clusters are there inside people's heads, but how many dimensions. What are the principal axes along which these representations are organized? Now, the way that most people tend to do this research, oops, I'm giving it away, is that they look at existing secondary data. So the American National Election Survey surveys thousands of respondents across the US in a nationally representative sample every 4 years. And one of the things that they do, including asking about people's preferences for candidates and parties and things, is they take a lot of thermometer ratings. That is how warmly you feel towards dozens of groups in American society. And it could be everyone from politicians and parties and political institutions through ethnic groups, through special interest groups, and so on. Okay. And again, people tend to believe that these feeling thermometer ratings are indirect indicators of how aligned people are with those groups. And so in principle, I don't personally want to make that assumption. I don't want to assume that how I feel about a group necessarily proxies for how aligned I am with that group. There are lots of groups where I could see that we have common interests, but I don't really like them. That's perfectly possible. Still, let's assume for a second that these feeling thermometers are indicators of alignment. Maybe there are only 2 clusters, in which case you would expect, how I feel, all those groups that I like should be highly correlated with one another. So across people, if I like this group and they're in the same cluster as another group, I should also like this group, right? That's going to yield a high positive correlation within a cluster. However, you should also observe either no correlation or a negative correlation from that cluster with all the groups that I don't like, who should form their own cluster by virtue of having very low warmth ratings. Does that make sense? Okay, so what I'm going to show you is basically a network built over the correlations across every possible pair of the social groups that are included in the ANES. Okay, so here we have the 2024 wave. And what I'm showing you here is an exploratory graph analysis of these feeling thermometers. Again, this is not ratings of alignment, it's just how much do you like each of these groups. And you'll see in here a big mix. There's political parties, there's institutions like the Supreme Court, and we use those as sort of spatial benchmarks to help us figure out, okay, what groups are going with these things that we know represent political interests, right? Okay, the edges here represent partial correlation between ratings of groups, where green is a positive correlation and red is a negative correlation. So one really obvious, strong red correlation here is between MAGA and liberals, right? It's a thick line indicating a larger partial correlation, but it's also red because people who like MAGA don't like liberals and vice versa. Is that clear? Okay. Then we use a totally data-driven approach to identify if there are communities within this data. And each of those communities is color-coded here. So there's a red cluster, and that very clearly seems to correspond to something like an ideological conservative cluster. There's a blue cluster, which seems to correspond to something like an ideologically liberal cluster. And I apologize if the labels are too small to see. I see so many of you squinting. But then there's a third cluster, this green cluster. And for those of you who can't see, it includes whites, Asian Americans, Chicanos, Hispanics, blacks, and that's it. Okay. So the most important thing to take away from here is that there isn't 2 clusters, there are 3, which means it could be that there's more than one dimension that organizes them. But again, let's not assume that feeling thermometers are the best way to think about political alignment, who we think goes with whom in politics in America. So we ran a field study, not a field study, but we ran a survey with over 1,200 respondents in a nationally representative sample. And instead of asking them questions like, who do you like, we asked them questions like this. How aligned is a typical member of the military with a typical voter from the Black community across 20 different political issues? And so we can get an estimate of actual number. And we gave them lots of examples of what those types of issues could be. And we asked them specifically about alignment between individuals from these different groups. They may be in the group, but they're always making judgments. This is a great question. So the question was just, but they're not in the group. They are making judgments, all pairwise judgments for 12 groups that we pulled from the ANES, and I'll show you what those groups are in just a second. But we also had them do another task, which is, how aligned are you with each of these 12 groups? So, interesting hypothesis here. You might imagine that there is some notion, some consensus of who goes with whom out there. And so there could be some homogeneity in how people build that map. Like I know, irrespective of whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican, that I know that Black and Hispanic voters tend to vote together, right? But we would expect quite a bit of heterogeneity in how each of these groups aligns with me, depending on what my political preferences and priorities are. So we ask both. Okay, so here I'm showing you, this is the group-to-group alignment, which does not include any of the U ratings. This is just how it is. We take the mean alignment score, and then for each possible pair, and then we subject it to a multidimensional scaling plot, which is derived from these average pairwise ratings of all of the different groups. Critically, this approach also allows us to project it into two-dimensional space, which yields some insight into whether or not there's a multidimensional or multiple principal axes along which people think about this. This graph did not have to come out this way. So the first thing you see is that we recapitulate the structure, the tripartite structure, from the ANES data. There's a liberal cluster, a conservative cluster, and a demographic cluster. This time it includes low income, Black, Hispanic, and labor. Okay. Green is up there on that second dimension, not because they're just more ideologically moderate. It's possible the green cluster could just show up between the blue and red, right? You don't require a second dimension to say that the demographic groups are just not as left or not as right. And critically, dimension one is very obviously ideology, right? Left is progressive, right is conservative. But what on earth is dimension two? What are people using to try to think about who goes with whom? And again, these demographic groups didn't need to cluster together either. They could have been scattered throughout the space. But no, people actually do rate them as highly aligned with one another. People say low-income Black, Hispanic, and labor voters are some of the most aligned voters in our sample. Does anyone want to guess what dimension two is? Yes. Something about historical status. Anyone else? I love that it's not totally obvious to you. That makes me feel like it's a contribution. Ooh. Interesting. So the lowest entity on dimension two is big business owners. Anyone? Okay, surprise. All right, I'm going to tell you. We think it's something like group alignment and common fate. That is to say that the folks who people load high on dimension two are the people who are concerned with everyday welfare concerns. Cost of living. Can I put gas in my car? Can I put food on the table for my children? And people perceive that those groups that are high on dimension two highly prioritize these kitchen table concerns, whereas groups that are low on dimension two tend to prioritize these narrower special interests. So it's not about left-right, it's much more about sort of societal welfare versus seeking to serve smaller segments or having more sort of ideologically tinged or focused goals. Now, one of the things that I think is really incredible about this is this common fate dimension. It's a possibility, but it's not necessarily certain that this is the case. So we ran a separate survey where we just asked people. So we told them, we want to understand how you perceive the political priorities of typical individuals from a myriad of groups in American society. And one important aspect of how people prioritize this is their focus on tangible everyday concerns. This includes cost of living, affording necessities, wages and job security, healthcare access and costs. And then afterwards, we presented them with pairs drawn from these 12 groups, and we said, of these two, which of these, thinking of the typical individual from each of these groups, which one's political priorities are more guided by everyday concerns? This is just a minor methodological point. You have to be careful not to use it like scales here because everyone thinks everyone cares about everything. But by using this forced choice methodology, you can actually build a rank ordering of those groups that is highest in terms of their concerns being these tangible everyday concerns versus lowest. Does that make sense? So again, if you just used a scale, everybody would just answer 10 out of 10 for everybody. But this gives you some level of discrimination. And so what we constructed was, on the y-axis here, I have their ranking on dimension 2 from the preceding, not their ranking, sorry, their loading on dimension 2 from the preceding study. And on the x-axis, we have their estimated rank ordering from this pairwise task, where we asked who cares more about the tangible everyday concern. And you see a pretty strong relationship here. In fact, when you take Christians out of the data set, it jumps to like 0.9. Okay, so if this hasn't convinced you that this is about sort of something like a shared fate with other people, I also told you we have some heterogeneity in the data because we can look at how aligned you are with each of these people. But because I think that just focusing, assuming party is the orienting line here is misguided, we used a data-driven approach to discover classes of people, segments or subgroups within our sample. So this correlational class analysis technique allows you to say, okay, there might be a couple of different kinds of maps in the data when we look at how you align with each of these groups. Can it detect some consistency in these clusters? And then you can go back and look at, well, okay, who are the folks who fall into each of these segments? In our data, we find 3. The first cluster is the largest. It's 65%. And it has an equal mix of Democrats and Republicans. And this is, again, one more reason not to just assume that party is going to be the dividing line, because there's lots of shared representation across parties in a big chunk of our sample. But there are 2 other classes that fall out here. The first is much smaller, 17%, and the next one is also about that size, 18%. The second class is majority Democrat, and the third class is majority Republican. The second class really seems to collapse the space into 2 camps. So these folks who skew Democrat and more politically knowledgeable say they pull all of the racial and ethnic groups into the Democratic Party, into the ideological left. Republican, the group that's a little bit more Republican leaning, pulls some of those groups actually towards the right. So for example, they're pulling Asian and Hispanic into their own tent in terms of how aligned they seem to be with those folks. And critically, when you look at this majority Republican cluster, they say, I'm highly aligned with low income and not at all with Black people. And that's how we know this isn't as simple as just like the size of the group somehow driving dimension 2 or something like this. It really does seem to be something like you and I, we have the same problems and we probably could work on them together. Okay. What does any of this have to do with reference dependence? Well, I think that this matters because what we know from everything else you've heard today is that even if perceptions of only one group shift, it has implications for how we think about the other groups. So let's say one cluster gets painted as much more ideologically extreme. That may lead people to believe that those remaining 2 clusters are much closer to each other by contrast to the cluster that is pulled away. But critically, the multidimensional space suggests that there's another axis along which people could be aligned. You don't necessarily have to ideologically moderate. Another way to achieve this is that you could just start to foreground those kitchen table concerns. And so it's not that you have to start to necessarily ignore your principles. It's more that you also have to emphasize it's not at the cost of caring about things like healthcare, cost of living, jobs, and so on and so forth. And so hopefully you're thinking, oh my God, Mina, you're doing the thing. You're doing the thing that you said we all should stop doing. You're using these categories and you're making all these assumptions about the people who live inside of these dots. And I would say, yes, you're absolutely right to call me out on that. In fact, I'm disappointed that one of you did not. But what I would say is that I'm not using these because I think there's something inherent in these categories that puts them in this political space like this. What I'm using is these groups as proxies of ways as an intermediate step to try to figure out what are these principal axes that we think make some people go with some members of American society, but not with others. And so you can think of it as this way. These labels are just buckets for the priorities and cares and values of the people within them. But that's the thing that's doing the work, the prioritization of the politics, not the groups themselves. So this, I would argue, is not the end point. But in the meantime, the buckets help us draw out what these dimensions could potentially be and how we can drive forward with the future research. Okay. So why does this matter? This is my last slide. I know how are we doing on time? We're coming close. Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so why does it matter? By being so focused on parties, we as researchers fall into this trap of illusory essences. This is this idea that even among the experts, these categories represent objective, definable, and fixed constructs, which in turn then reifies the very essentialism in the literature that we're all saying we're seeking to dismantle because we want people to be less polarized. But we're the ones who are constantly talking and laundering these notions of these parties as monoliths. In fact, if anything, we've pushed the conversation. We're more ideologically sorted. We're more demographically sorted. But the demographic data actually don't indicate knowing your race and ethnicity today does not make me any better at predicting your voting preferences than 30 years ago. It's a perception. It's not the reality in the data. So how does identity-based thinking increase polarization? I'm saying that it does, but you're saying, okay, maybe it doesn't, Mina. It turns out that this is something social psychologists know quite well from attribution theory. The more we think that a person's behavior is motivated by their personality, something essential in them, something about them, the less likely we think they will change. The less likely we think it's possible to negotiate with them. And in fact, there's this beautiful Rothschild paper here in 2019 that finds precisely this. Folks who think about partisanship as though it was a trait, like a personality, they are the most affectively polarized and the least likely to want to talk to people from the other side. But if we think instead of partisanship as being not the input, but the product of social processes, it's the output. It's these groups that go together that give rise to the party. It's not the parties exist and then organize the groups. Maybe it's the other way matters too. And if we think about it that way, well, then we can start to ask different questions. Well, what pressures are pushing people in this versus this direction, or this versus this direction? And then you speak to those concerns rather than just, rah-rah party labels. And then finally, I would say that this dimensional approach draws attention to the fact that political elites create new groups in society in order to draw divisions and highlight boundaries between these constituent groups. It's a political project of organizing society. And we have working class was a totally political invention in the 70s to try to describe a certain class of voters within the US. Feminists as well. Same thing, if I had told you, 10 years ago, oh, are you woke? You would have looked at me like I'm crazy. Like, I'm standing in front of you, I'm awake. What do you mean am I woke? But now that means something, and it's actually used very specifically as a cudgel to divide those people who are woke versus those who are not, or whether we're tired of wokeism and so on and so forth. So I do think that it's incredibly important because political coalitions can breathe life into new groupings, and then those have an effect on how we see all these other groups scattered into political space. Okay, so with that, I realized I didn't have all that. Okay, so with all that, I would just say, prejudice is not intransigent nor derived exclusively from parties' essentialized properties, and parties and partisans are reference dependent. And we need to always be thinking about this because the political elites know, but try to include this from the voters. And with that, I want to thank all of my funding sources and especially all of you, my brilliant grad student Isaias, who's the lead author on this last project. I absolutely want to highlight him. And I'm very happy to take questions and have further discussion now. Thank you so much.
Now, I have this tough job of not allowing many questions now, so perhaps I see one there and perhaps a last one, only 2 questions, please.
Okay.
So it's more or less corresponds to the time we have. And then, Ralu, if you could kindly leave for later, because you will have an opportunity to speak. I know you are excited, you want to discuss, and we love that. But so another person who hasn't spoken yet. So let's go with first.
Okay,
please.
thank you. Thank you, I enjoyed a lot. Just my question is, when I saw the 3 dimensions, it recalled directly Schwartz's 12 values. So there is maybe research, or have you ever thought about that these values are reflected somehow into these groups?
Yeah, that's a gorgeous question. And I really love putting it, especially couching it in terms of sort of cross-cultural research, because that's precisely the direction I'm trying to push everything. I don't want this to be a project about US politics. I want it to be a project about how political coalitions are built the world over. And so one of the main the primary distinctions people make tends to be between cultural and economic issues. I don't think this boils down to that because we have both cultural and economic issues within that dimension 1, and dimension 2 has some mix of both. I mean, it's definitely an emphasis on the economic, but it's not uniquely that, right? Because big business, for example, is an economic issue, and then it's also pulled super far right. But in terms of these cultural issues, I think that that's really, really interesting. One person that I've shown this to has offered potentially that maybe dimension 2 is also related to something like anti-establishment preferences. So it's not just about everyday welfare concerns, but it's also about not seeing your interests necessarily well represented. And so what it is like it's also a political prioritization of something different, something new, in order to try to address these concerns. My question would then be, okay, well, what is it you want to be different or new? And that's why we came to these common fate ideas. But that said, I think I hadn't considered Schwartz's cultural values, and I think that that's a really, really lovely way to potentially try to organize these things or fit alternative models?
Because there's a thing that we start with values and beliefs and norms, and I could see these value, beliefs, norms in this research, in the sense to enrich or to go to the beginning and how to change the perception, because we are grown up in the based on our experiences and all these ethnic minority groups, and they have all these different value belief norms, right?
Yeah.
Just give this opinion. Thank you.
No, it's a gorgeous point. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really love that. Yeah.
One last question, perhaps.
Only one. Boo.
Anyone? Oh, there's, let's see. So, yes, Maria Cristina, the last question, please.
Okay, so this is very connected to what she was asking. Dimension 2, I'm just wondering why you think Dimension 2 is welfare, because business is not so much about welfare.
No.
And maybe you could have looked at things like, the health system or education or whatever, or pension or things that are more. So I was wondering whether this dimension was somehow determined or influenced strongly by this cluster on like feminist and environmental and whatever. And this is one thing, and this is a question, and just a note that basically it seems that these days coalitions are seeing, there's not many, there's no coalition in the US, but in Europe, parties don't won with majority usually, and they have to build coalitions. So, and coalition seems to be associated with, you're giving up on your convictions. And I think that's the wrong way to see it, but I don't know how to, and sometimes that makes you lose votes.
Yeah.
And so people.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Both of those are great questions. So this was partially my mistake, maybe, for using the word welfare. In that case, I didn't mean about specifically redistribution policies. I meant just caring about what happens to other people. So a more global sense of welfare. But we did, within the tangible concerns questions, ask about all these other features like healthcare access, jobs, and affordability. So we didn't just collapse it down to like redistribution. Yeah, but that was my fault for using the word welfare when I meant it not as the policy, but as a much broader just consideration of other people's well-being. And then the second thing is on what happens in political coalitions and multi-parties. This is exactly where I want to go next, in part because I would hope that we would see that there's some evidence for, as it is that, for example, extreme parties either disappear, like I understand the extreme left has kind of disappeared in Spanish politics rather recently, but then you also have is it Vox? Is the extreme, right? And so, depending on how big they are and also how popular they are, you might make different predictions about how it is the more moderate right party may get pushed away, like they do in Germany, from the extreme right, or pulled towards the extreme right, like it seems to be happening in Spanish politics. And so what is the delimiting factor that determines whether it goes one way or the other way? I think I would love to do exactly this project. And I think that it's going to also matter on how when a party is labeled as extreme, it's extreme on what particular dimensions. I mean, usually immigration is going to be like the flag issue for these extreme political parties. But it could be that they're also simultaneously making arguments for like cost of living, in which case that could engender more support than you would otherwise see for an extreme right party that wasn't foregrounding these sort of kitchen table concerns. And so that may be a pathway forward. And certainly that's part of, I think, what's happening in America.
So, okay, there's hope. Yeah. So, which is something amazing to hear in these days, yes. And we had all the colors here. So we had green, red, blue here. So now, just before we finish, I want to mention that we are recording that. So we are going to make that available. I want to thank colleagues from other centers that I saw later, from La Salle, for instance. And so thank you so much for sharing that with us. And then to thank the students, because in these TikTok days, yes, you have shown great stamina.
2 hours.
Of going through 1 hour and a half. So it's wonderful. So
I
thank
love all
you.
of you.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Thanks, Mina, again.